September 2023. HS2's projected lifetime cost has risen beyond £100 billion in 2019 prices, depending on inflation and remaining scope. What began as a £33 billion high-speed rail line is now one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in British history. It is neither completed nor formally cancelled. It exists in a prolonged state of partial construction and political suspension. This isn't a story about theft or corruption. It's about how large projects fail quietly through optimism, inertia, and political fear. HS2 didn't collapse. It expanded until it could no longer justify itself. This is the story of how Britain built a project it could no longer control and couldn't bring itself to stop. HS2 was announced in 2009, a vision intended to cut journey times between London and the North, rebalance the UK economy, and increase rail capacity for decades. The numbers looked manageable because the benefits attached looked transformative, and fortunately, the political case was easy. From the start, HS2 was framed as inevitable. The Gordon Brown Labour government estimated the project would cost £37.5 billion in 2009 prices. Construction would be phased: London to Birmingham, then Birmingham to Crewe, and finally Crewe to Manchester. A separate arm would link Birmingham to Leeds. And this had a clear promise attached to it. Trains running at 225 miles per hour, 18 trains per hour through London Euston, a capacity that would last generations. The economic case rested on one key assumption: passengers could not work on trains. Every minute spent travelling was a wasted minute. High-speed rail would recover that lost productivity. An impressive pitch, but the foundation was weak. Former Minister Peter Mandelson later revealed that the early cost estimates were almost entirely speculative. The project lacked a detailed design. Ground surveys were incomplete. Land acquisition costs were guesses. But the political momentum was already building. Large infrastructure projects rarely begin with pessimism. HS2 was no exception. Early forecasts assumed stable land costs, predictable engineering challenges, limited legal resistance, and continuous political support. None of those assumptions held. Environmental objections mounted almost immediately. Legal challenges multiplied. Engineering complexity increased as detailed designs were developed. But the response was never reassessment, just revision. Between 2011 and 2013, costs rose by £12.6 billion in cash terms. This included £7.5 billion for rolling stock that had not been previously costed, and an additional £5.1 billion for construction. HS2 Limited, the non-departmental public body responsible for managing the project, attempted to reduce costs between 2015 and 2017. It assumed efficiencies in property acquisition, contractor delivery, and overhead reduction. These efficiencies were not found. The project also suffered from insufficient contingency planning. HS2 Limited held less than half the contingency that Crossrail maintained during its early development. This left no buffer for unexpected problems. And unexpected problems were everywhere. As construction companies developed detailed designs, they discovered ground conditions were far worse than anticipated. The cost of civil engineering for Phase 1 rose by £5 billion between 2017 and 2019, accounting for nearly half the cost increase on that section alone. The route itself became a political battleground. HS2 required parliamentary approval through a hybrid bill, a rare legislative process that allowed affected parties to petition for changes. The process gave MPs significant power to negotiate. Much of the route cut through rural Conservative constituencies. Their support came with a price. Tunnels were lengthened to protect the Chilterns. Noise barriers were added. Cuttings were deepened to hide the tracks. Stations were redesigned multiple times. One former Secretary of State for Transport recalled an afternoon session where committee members added a couple of $100 million to the budget through assurances and concessions. A railway designed by compromise emerged. On a 49-minute journey from London to Birmingham, passengers would see the countryside for only 9 minutes. The rest would be tunnels, cuttings, or barriers. These changes added vast sums to the cost. HS2 Limited estimated that scope changes accounted for £1 billion of the cost increase between 2017 and 2019 alone. The scope changes were only part of the problem. HS2 passed through multiple prime ministers, multiple transport secretaries, and multiple funding frameworks. No single administration owned the outcome. Each inherited the problem, each deferred the reckoning. David Cameron approved the project. Theresa May hesitated but continued it. Boris Johnson expanded it, then scaled it back. Rishi Sunak cancelled the northern leg. Keir Starmer inherited what remained. Cancelling HS2 became politically harder than continuing it. By 2015, costs were rising. By 2017, they were accelerating. By 2019, the original budget was no longer credible. A 2019 review conducted by HS2's chairman, Alan Cook, suggested final costs would be between £72.1 and £78.4 billion in 2015 prices. The review admitted early estimates were overly optimistic. The Oakervee Review, commissioned by the government the same year, did not re-examine costs. It relied on Cook's findings. The review's deputy chair, Lord Berkeley, published a dissenting report arguing that costs would reach £100 to £110 billion due to underestimates of land purchases, maintenance, and Euston redevelopment. He was dismissed as pessimistic. In April 2020, the full business case for Phase 1 gave the cost range of £35 to £45 billion. The total forecast reached £108.9 billion in 2015 prices. Each review concluded the same thing. Stopping now would waste what had already been spent. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action. Money already spent became the justification for spending more. By 2023, £24.7 billion had been spent. Of that, £22.5 billion went to Phase 1. Construction had barely begun on the northern sections, but land had been purchased, communities had been disrupted, contracts had been signed. The project had become too expensive to finish as planned and too advanced to cancel cleanly. As costs spiraled, the government began cutting back. In November 2021, the eastern arm linking Birmingham to Leeds was scrapped. This removed a critical element of the original economic case. Connectivity to the north was supposed to drive regional growth. Without Leeds, that promise was broken. In October 2023, Rishi Sunak used the Conservative Party conference speech in Manchester to announce the cancellation of the Birmingham to Manchester leg. The irony was not lost on anyone. He stood in Manchester to tell the city it would not get the railway it had been promised. Billions had already been spent on Phase 2. Land had been acquired. Preparatory work had been completed. The economic rationale that justified HS2 no longer applied, but the costs were real and irreversible. The government promised to reallocate £36 billion from the cancelled phases to regional transport projects. Critics argued this was an attempt to rebrand failure as investment. HS2 was no longer one project. It had become a collection of compromises. Phase 2 scrapped. Northern legs cancelled. London to Birmingham isolated. The original vision had fractured entirely. By the early 2020s, HS2 faced a perfect storm. Inflation surged, construction costs exploded, and supply chains tightened. But HS2 absorbed all of it. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority stated in 2023 that successful delivery of the project appears to be unachievable. In 2024, HS2's new chief executive, Mark Wilde, told MPs that construction had started way too early without necessary design and planning approvals in place. He argued that to break the cycle of overspending, the project needed to be ongoing until at least 2026 to establish a proper baseline program. The National Audit Office agreed. It concluded that HS2 needed to take the time needed to properly reset to deliver value for money. Contracts needed rewriting. Timelines needed recalculation. The entire project needed restructuring. The project reached a critical point. Too advanced to cancel, too expensive to complete. Paralysis followed. In June 2025, Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander confirmed what many had suspected. The 2033 completion date was undeliverable. She announced that when the line does open, it may initially run at slower speeds than planned to prevent further delays. She also released two damning reports. The James Stewart Review detailed historic mishandling, lack of ministerial oversight, and inadequate control by HS2 Limited. It revealed constant scope changes, ineffective contracts, and bad management that would cost taxpayers billions. Mark Wilde's initial assessment stated bluntly that the project, in terms of cost, schedule, and scope, was unsustainable. Alexander promised an update on revised costs and timelines by the end of 2025. No firm completion date was given. No final cost was confirmed. The government appointed Mike Brown as the new chair of HS2 Limited. Brown had previously delivered the Elizabeth Line, bringing it in on schedule and on budget after years of delays. The hope was that he could repeat the feat. But HS2 was not Crossrail. The scale of mismanagement was deeper. The political damage was greater. The financial hole was wider. By 2025, over £27 billion had been spent based on 2019 prices. Inflation adjustments would push the total higher. The remaining work from London to Birmingham alone was estimated to cost between £49 and £67 billion, depending on inflation and further delays. The economic case had collapsed. The original benefit-cost ratio of 2.4 had fallen to 1.5 in 2020. After the pandemic reduced train usage and Phase 2 was cancelled, the ratio fell to 0.8, which was graded as a poor value for money. Benefit-cost ratios vary by methodology and revision, but all recent official assessments place Phase 1 in the low or poor value for money category. The northern legs that promised the greatest return, with a benefit-cost ratio of 1.8, were gone. What remained was Phase 1, graded as low value for money with a ratio of just 1.2. HS2 had become an infrastructure project, delivering minimal economic return at maximum cost. HS2 wasn't an anomaly. It exposed deep flaws in Britain's planning, approval, and delivery of infrastructure. The first flaw was optimism bias. Early estimates were aspirational rather than realistic. Contingencies were inadequate. Risks were underestimated. The second flaw was political handoffs. No government owns the full life cycle. Each administration inherited a problem and passed it forward. Accountability evaporated across long timelines. The third flaw was scope creep without consequence. Every petition, every negotiation, every compromise added cost. But no mechanism existed to reassess whether the project still made sense. The fourth flaw was the sunk cost fallacy embedded in decision-making. Reviews adjusted forecasts instead of asking whether to continue. The billions already spent became the justification for spending billions more. The fifth flaw was weak institutional oversight. HS2 Limited lacked effective control. The Department for Transport lacked effective scrutiny. Reviews that should have halted the project instead recommended continuation. One chartered surveyor who challenged HS2 for nearly a decade observed, "There has always been a fundamental problem in this country with the cost of building anything, because we live on a small, highly populated, property-owning, democratic island." Britain's planning system rewards delay. Its legal system enables repeated challenges. Its political system incentivizes short-term thinking. A 2018 government study found that high-speed rail generally costs around £32 million per kilometre globally. Even in 2018, Phase 1 of HS2 was budgeted at £250 million per kilometre. It has roughly doubled since. France has over 1,000 miles of high-speed rail, but France has more land and fewer legal obstacles. China has nearly 30,000 miles, but China has centralized power and limited protest rights. Britain's system makes building difficult. That isn't necessarily wrong. The question is whether the country is willing to confront the trade-offs. How deep is the appetite for individuals to have their lives disrupted in the name of national interest? How should century-long infrastructure investments be valued? These questions govern how the system works. But the deeper question is whether Britain chose the right project at all. Critics argue that the answer to Britain's transport needs is not a single grand megaproject serving a handful of cities. It's many smaller projects, bus lanes, tram systems, new stations, and regional connectivity. HS2's defenders counter that, without ambitious projects, Britain will never modernize its infrastructure. They argue that once the line opens, public opinion will shift. People will demand the rest of it be built. But that assumes the line opens. HS2 didn't fail because Britain stopped believing in it. It failed because Britain couldn't stop believing after the numbers changed. The project became a lesson in escalation, in how momentum replaces judgment, in how continuing feels safer than admitting error. The question now is not what went wrong. The question is whether the system that produced HS2 can be reformed before the next megaproject fails in exactly the same way. Until then, HS2 will remain a reminder of how projects become too big to stop, not because they succeed, but because failure is too expensive to admit.